going on? Welcome to the Matt Bernier Show, DRF TV, live.drf.com, livestream.com, the Daily Racing Forms Twitter handle at DRF Inside Post, as well as the Daily Racing Forms Facebook page. My name is Matt Bernier. You can follow me on Twitter, at Bernier_Matt. This is the recap edition of the Matt Bernier Show, going back and taking a look at some big racing action from the weekend of September the 15th and the 16th. Grade 1 action galore, but most notably up at Woodbine, north of the border in Canada. We'll go over all those big races, as well as a few other ones, including Sands Point from down at Belmont Park. A brief stakes montage this weekend. We'll give you the weekend's best as far as buyer speed figures are concerned, and then we'll also give you a little bit of a heads up what's to come this week here on DRF TV. If you are listening to this live, thank you for doing so. If you listen to a podcast, though, like most of you do, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, video.drf.com, as well as Spotify. And if you're over on YouTube, click that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. You get all the latest as far as DRF TV is concerned with offerings and things of that nature. Give us a thumbs up as well while you're over there. And over on iTunes, write us a little review. Give us a positive rating. It's always greatly appreciated. I've had to change the camera angle a little bit just because something was going on with my neck. So you see my calendar in the back. If you think it's silly looking, then maybe I'll have to move it. But for the time being, just for some physical help, we'll move a little bit. Let's dive into the racing. Okay, right off at the top, we'll go with the big one up at Woodbine. This is the marquee event, the main event of the entire Woodbine meeting. We're going to take a look at the Grade 1 Rico Woodbine Mile, one-turn mile on the turf course. Field of 8 signed on. This race boiled down to a few different things. Leading into it, it looked like there wasn't a ton of speed signed on. That was even more evident when La Sardane, the filly, did not go against the boys. That left you with the field of 8, and it kind of felt like Oscar Performance, who was going to be forwardly placed. Tactically, he had a major advantage. The question was, what the heck happened in the Arlington Million most recently, and would he be able to rebound? If it's not him, who would it be? Would it be the eventual post-time favorite in Delta Prince, who we know what he's capable of? He likes Woodbine. He's had success at that one-turn configuration up there in the past. Ultimately, we got kind of a merry-go-round. Here's the stretch run of this year's Woodbine Mile.
Performance heads for home, joined by Mr. Haverkamp on the outside. Right behind them, Delta Prince, Stormy Antarctic, Oscar Performance and Mr. Haverkamp. Divisadero and Stormy Antarctic running on, Delta Prince behind. Oscar Performance in front, Oscar Performance and Mr. Haverkamp neck and neck. And down in third, Stormy Antarctic, but it's Oscar Performance, shrugs them off. A gate-to-wire winner. Oscar Performance by a length and a half, Mr. Haverkamp, Stormy Antarctic and Delta Prince.
Oscar Performance gets the job done as the second choice at odds of 5-2 over Mr. Haverkamp. The local hope beneath Eurico Rosa da Silva runs a game second at odds of 8-1, and Stormy Antarctic, one of the European invaders, runs third at odds of 15-1. Your beaten favorite Delta Prince runs fourth at odds of 2-1. Let's talk about Oscar Performance a little bit more. He's 8 of 14 lifetime, 9 times in the money. Over $2.3 million in career earnings, owned by Ammerman Racing LLC, trained by Brian Lynch, bred by Mrs. Jerry Ammerman in Kentucky, ridden to victory by Jose Ortiz, and you see the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card. He's by Kitten's Joy out of a theatrical mare named Divine Actress. No time form U.S. figures are in at the time of this being recorded, so we're only dealing with buyer speed figures. Oscar Performance earns a 104 buyer. You see the runner-up and the third-place finisher, Mr. Haverkamp and Stormy Antarctic. They both come back to earn 100 buyers. And then everyone else drops down a little bit, 98, 97, 95, 94, respectively. The story of this race, when you look at the chart, I mean, it's hard to argue with this. When you see the pace that was thrown up, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that time form will probably have this on the slow side of things. Horses of this caliber, getting a quarter mile in 24-3, getting a half mile in 48-3, and sure, they picked it up a little bit, but even that third quarter, hitting that 6 furlong point in 11-2, for horses of this caliber, they're capable of going much, much faster. And Oscar Performance, when you let him do that, you give him an inch, he's going to take not only a mile, he'll take 5 miles. He's a very talented horse. Brian Lynch has done a great job. Again, this is a horse that you didn't know what you were going to get coming out of that Arlington Million, because it was just such an inexplicably poor performance, and he was eased, and you assumed everything was good if he was coming back here, but still, it's very difficult to trust horses off such poor efforts. Well, he put all that sort of to bed, all those fears. It's very difficult, though, if you're any of the other horses trying to come from off the pace. When you get a horse like Oscar Performance, who has the ability that he does, and if you give him that sort of soft pace situation, he's going to be able to fire home just as fast as you guys are. So when you look at these final quarter miles, Depending if you want to look at the incremental fractions in Formulator or you choose to look at the Trackist charts for Woodbine, they're slightly off here and there, but I mean, we're talking by hundredths of a second, not tenths or anything drastic. In unison, though, and sort of across the board, all of these fractions are telling you that the final quarter was in sub 22 for basically the entire field. When you get a horse like Oscar Performance who comes home in 21.63 according to Formulator, it's going to be very difficult if you're any of these other horses. A horse like, let's even use Stormy Antarctic, who was more mid-pack throughout. He comes home in 21.50. Any other time, that's going to be just an electric come-home time. But when they went as slow as they did, he really had no chance to make up any sort of ground. An impressive performance from Oscar Performance. Brian Lynch was quoted afterwards saying, "I thought Jose rode him beautifully, and his last quarter was sensational. It's nice to see him back, and it's a win and you're in, and we've got 6 weeks to the Breeders' Cup. Now we can take a deep breath and do the best we can to have him right on that day." This is a kind of horse where, again, he doesn't have to have the lead. He's shown that he can sit and be effective off of a target and go and get them. You always have to consider these horses dangerous. I mean, he reminds me a little bit from a tactical standpoint, like a Tepin, like a Wise Dan, those kind of horses that they can be up there relatively close to the front end, and they're going to finish with a serious late bid. Now, again, the question becomes, do you totally trust, first things first, do you totally trust that he's back? Because this, call a spade, this was a soft trip. He ran great, but this was a soft trip. He had everything go his way. If you think he's back, that's great. But then you also have to factor in that he's coming out of a race that, you know, things went perfectly for him. It's unlikely that they'll go perfectly for him in the Breeders' Cup Mile. The tactical speed and that tactical ability that he brings, that's going to make it a heck of a lot easier for him to pull a good trip than some of these other horses. But still, at the end of the day, you need to make decisions because he's going to be one of the choices in a race like that, the Breeders' Cup Mile. And coming off of a pretty cushy situation in the Woodbine Mile, that's for you to decide. At the end of the day, you can't argue. This was a very, very impressive performance from him. Thought Mr. Haverkamp ran very well. The connections have to be pleased. Stormy Antarctic obviously ran well. Delta Prince, to me, was the disappointment of the race because he had a really good trip. He sat in just behind, and I know the pace never came back to him, but he actually went backwards. He just never looked like he was really traveling well. Javier Castellano, the rider afterward, regarding Delta Prince, really disappointing. He didn't show up today for some reason. He was flat, had a nice, comfortable rhythm behind the winner, but when I asked him at the top of the stretch, he just didn't respond. We've seen this horse run better than this. I think perhaps you want to give him a mulligan at some point. But, again, to be fair, if I'm saying this about Oscar Performance, where you need to take a look and say, well, you know, things went well and it all worked out for you, and maybe that's why I want to be a little bit leery or question if I want to use you next time. With Delta Prince, this was such a poor performance, even though he may have been a little bit compromised by the pace situation. I'd have to question if he shows up in a big race. Do I really want to get involved with him? A couple other horses, the ones toward the back. Lord Glitters, you don't want to hold this one against him again because he was coming over here and the pace just never materialized. He came home very, very quickly. I think you can say the same for Good Samaritan. The only problem with trying to say that for Good Samaritan, and I picked Good Samaritan in this race, there's still at least a question about can he actually still run. Now, he finished home, you know, again, like everyone else, sub 22, and I think he was in that 22-2 sort of 21-2 final quarter range. So, I mean, he was coming home legitimately quick, but I do think there is that little sort of concern, can he run at all? We don't really know for certain. I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, and if he shows up in a spot, not the Breeders' Cup, but if he shows up somewhere else in a mile event, perhaps that'll be an instance where you can get an inflated number, and I think really that's what it boils down to. It's one thing to excuse a subpar effort if you're going to get a very, very square price in the next race. It's another thing to say, well, poor performance, I'll just give him the benefit of the doubt when you're going to be one of the favorites in the next spot. And ultimately, again, this game, all it does is boil down to value. You need to look at it and make a determination on your own as the handicapper. Call me crazy. I still think Divisadero has a chance in a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile, should they go there. This is a horse that was compromised again by the pace situation at the top of the lane. Looked like he was full of run. And you know what? He finished well. He came home, according to Formulator, in 21.72. I don't know that I want to hold this race against him first time in a configuration like this. First time he'd ever been up to Woodbine. He loves Churchill Downs, and if you give him more pace to run at, I think he's going to come with a late bid. I don't know if the connections are going to choose to go that far with him and go to the Breeders' Cup. I hope they do, because I think he still fits in there. I really do. And he'll be a giant price at that point. I mean, he was, what, 14-1 in this race. He was 10-1 in the 4-star Dave. You would assume he's going to be minimum 25 to 1 or greater in a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile, should they choose to go there. If they don't, obviously entirely understandable. Maybe you think he can't quite do it anymore. I'm not totally convinced just yet. If you give him pace and you get him at Churchill, I wonder if Divisadero is a horse that can spring a little bit of an upset, or at the very least maybe threaten to hit the board and spice up exotics. But this race boiled down to pace, making the race, and the pace setter being a very, very talented horse, and he's in great hands with Brian Lynch and Jose Ortiz aboard. Oscar Performance gets back to his winning ways with a 1-0 buyer in this year's Woodbine Mile, and it sounds like it is on to bigger and better things. He's probably going to be one of the favorites down at Churchill Downs here in a few weeks in the Breeders' Cup Mile. The other Grade 1 at Woodbine on Saturday was also on the turf, but it was at 1.5 miles, and you had a little bit of international flavor in this one as well, specifically with Hawkbill. Here was the field for the Grade 1 Northern Dancer, again, 1.5 miles on the grass. Hawkbill is the international known commodity. We know he's won all over the place. He's won in Dubai, he's won in Europe. He came over here and probably should have won this race last year, if we're being honest. But he didn't. And that made me a little bit leery coming into a spot like this to trust him at odds of 9-5. The problem is, I was never going to have the winner, the horse that ultimately prevailed in this spot. For the second year in a row, Johnny Bear gets the job done. Here's the stretch run of this year's Northern Dancer.
On Hawkbill, 'tis a slam on the outside, and 'tis a slam and Hawkbill neck and neck, coming at the market off. Johnny Bear up the rail, Hawkbill in deep water, and now comes Mektal. Mektal on the outside, mowing them down gradually. Many chances. Mektal and out wider, English Illusions coming with a burst. It is on the rail, Johnny Bear. Mektal on the outside, English Illusion out wider. Johnny Bear has done it again. Mektal second, English Illusion and market off in the show photo.
Johnny Bear at odds of 16 to 1 does it again. He wins the Grade 1 Northern Dancer over the late closing Mektal, with Jose Ortiz aboard at odds of 3 to 1, and English Illusion runs third at odds of 34 to 1. If you included him in your trifecta and you chose to play that for $2, it came back just under $1,700. Johnny Bear, let's talk about him a little bit more. 8 times a winner from 40 lifetime starts, just under $700,000 in career earnings. Owned by Colbert Farms and Bear Stables Limited. Trained by Ashley Brignas. Bred by Tall Oaks Farm in Ontario. Ridden to victory by Luis Contreras. And you see the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card. He is by English Channel out of a horse chestnut mare named In Return. 98 Beyer speed figure for Johnny Bear, 97 for Mektal, 96s for English Illusion and Mark It Off. Then you drop down to 95 for Patterson Cross. This was a race, and I hate to just be very, very vague about it. Not vague, but blunt more so. I just don't think there was a heck of a lot of running going on in a spot like this. Take a look and see. You had a half length. These are the differences from position to position final. Half length between first and second, half between second and third, nose between third and fourth, a neck between fourth and fifth, and 3/4 of the length between fifth and sixth. This is a blanket finish. There's a reason that you had some bizarre results. To me, this is not necessarily going to be a key race going forward. The connections of Johnny Bear, tip your cap to them. They've done another great job. They got another Grade 1 out of this horse. But if we're being, if we're looking at this race trying to pull something out of it going forward, I think you look at it and you say, Hawkbill, for one reason or another, he's very good when things go his way. When he has a little bit of heat pressure, little bit, he's no superstar. And I know that probably sounds a little bit over the top and a little bit sort of harsh because he's a multiple Group 1 winner all over the world, but I've yet to see anything that would suggest to me that he is some sort of world beater. And I was just using the whole world comparison, but you get my point that when things get cranked up a little bit on him early, and by the way, it's not like they were going that fast. 24-1, 49-1, 13-1 for 3/4. And I understand he was taking pressure throughout from Tiz a Slam. You still have to finish better than you did. He was in deep water halfway around the far turn. I don't know. Just Hawkbill. This was to me just one of those instances where it exposed him for what he is. He's a nice horse, but he's not the horse that I think some folks have made him out to be. That he is, one of the best over in Europe. I don't believe that. The 2 times he's come over here for these races, terrible loss last year, and he was awful on this day. And I know Jamie Spencer said, well, that other horse that was hassling us that cost us the race. Well, I mean, do you want him to just kind of like hand it over to you on a silver platter? And also, if we're going to use that as sort of the barometer of what you should or shouldn't be capable of, Tiz Slam still finished 5 lengths in front of Hawkbill. Enough for me bashing Hawkbill. Johnny Bear took advantage of a good pace situation. He was always traveling very well. I thought Contreras did what he was supposed to do, specifically when you got probably maybe halfway down the stretch run. And again, the stretch goes on forever down at Woodbine. I love that he just immediately said, you know what, we're going to go down to the inside, and hopefully this is going to be the winning move, and you hope that whomever is just to your outside doesn't end up floating in and closing off that path. I thought at that point, Contreras rode him perfectly and said, this is the only chance that we have to win. We're not going to be able to split going to the outside. Let's just dive down there, and hopefully we can quicken and get through it, and that's exactly what happened. He came home in 24:36. Mektal came home in 24:18. You know what? I don't have much to say about the top 3 or 4 finishers. I thought they all ran well. I suppose you can say that Marketov, maybe you want to give him a little bit of extra credit because he was relatively close to the pace. That it did, to be fair, kind of come apart, but I think that was more a product of just the top 2 not being particularly strong with the ones that were setting the pace, meaning the top 2. The top 2 finishers ran very well in this spot. Mektal, he's got a little bit of a penchant now. I'm starting to feel a development of a seconditis where he'll get close, but he won't quite get over the top. It is what it is. I think the rest of the field, I don't have a heck of a lot to say here. Upmost was certainly disappointing. Expected more out of him. Patterson Cross was a horrific underlay. I liked him in this spot, but he was 10-1 on the morning line. I never would have sniffed him at 4-1. But he ran a Patterson Cross kind of race. I just don't think there's a heck of a lot to pull out of this as far as, let's say, Breeders' Cup implications. I would be stunned if any of these horses ended up in the Breeders' Cup, and then doubly so if they did, and then they were legitimate threats in a spot like that. I think this is one of those instances where you look at it and you say Johnny Bear loves that turf course, likes the 1.5 miles. He's had great sort of handling from the connections. They've really, really when you look at it, slowly but surely, this was clearly the goal at the end of the day. And they got him here in good order, and he took advantage of a good pace situation. But give credit where credit's due. He was traveling great the entirety of the race, and he went on and he got the job done. And now he is a multiple Grade 1 winner in this race at 1.5 miles. Really cool story, really cool horse for Johnny Bear, the 7-year-old. He gets the job done. Like I said, for the rest of the field, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that Hawkbill, you give him any sort of resistance, it's not going to work. He's not going to go on with it. Now, perhaps he doesn't like Woodbine, but we've seen other instances, too, where he is up there forwardly placed and he just fades down the lane. So it is what it is. At the end of the day, don't want to take too much away from the actual horses that did some good running in a spot like this and their connections. Johnny Bear, 2 years running. He is the winner of the Grade 1 Northern Dancer up at Woodbine. He gets the job done this year with a 98 Beyer speed figure. On to Belmont Park, 3-year-old fillies going 1.1 miles on the inner turf course. It was a yielding inner turf course. The field for the Sands Point, there were 8 of them signed on, and the final time would suggest that the turf course had some significant give in it. The fractions of the race would suggest that there was some significant give, but ultimately this race boiled down to an out-of-town rider with an out-of-town horse making a very, very early move, but the correct move, and taking advantage. Larry Colmus with the stretch run of this year's Sands Point.
Victorine to the outside, and she's moving up as well. Capla Temptress is next. Shadon is given way toward the inside. Furlong to run, California Gold Rush, Secret Message, and Victorine. California Gold Rush digs in on the lead. Secret Message draws up alongside. Victorine is third, Colonia fourth down the center. California Gold Rush and Secret Message. California Gold Rush, a determined winner of the Sands Point.
California Gold Rush coming in for Neil Drysdale and Flavien Prat. They get the job done at odds of 3-1 as your favorite, ahead of Secret Message, the second place finisher, at odds of 9-1, and then Colonia runs third at odds of 11-1. Let's take a look at California Gold Rush. She's 3 or 4 lifetime, never been out of the money in 4 lifetime starts, $322,000 in career earnings, owned and bred by Alice Bamford in Kentucky, trained by Neil Drysdale, ridden to victory by Flavien Prat. In the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card, she is by Cape Blanco out of a Chamardal mare named Caraba. 91 Beyer speed figure for California Gold Rush winning this race. She comes home in 12:50, but really, again, when you consider the condition of this turf course and the way that the race was run, the fact that Pratt was able to make the move that he did, for what it's worth, the fractions 25 and 4, 52 for a half, 117 flat for 3/4. There was no pace whatsoever, and even with a soft or yielding sort of condition, you're usually going to get slower fractions no matter what, but this seemed exceptionally slow, and it took a heads-up move from Flavien Prat. Going into the first turn, he's caught wide. He talked about it a little bit in a post-race interview. The quote was, "Going into the first turn, I was trying to get cover, and I found myself too wide, and we were walking. I decided to get a little closer. She relaxed well. I was a little worried about the soft turf, but she handled it well. She just keeps improving." He was able to get her going into the early sort of lack of pace and take advantage and all of a sudden take up a perfect sort of stalking position. And to me, that was the difference maker, because then you also saw Secret Message with Johnny Velasquez, who unfortunately was very wide throughout. And I suppose you can look at it and say she's only beaten by a half length, and perhaps that's the difference between a win and a loss, because she was 4 or 5 paths wide. But at the same time, I do feel like this was as good as she could have worked out a trip, considering the way the race was being run and where she was positioned early on. I thought the fact that Johnny V kind of went on and followed California Gold Rush, I think that was sort of the move that at least allowed her the opportunity to only get beat by a half length, if that makes sense. I think she ran very well, but I don't know entirely that it is black and white, that because she had carried this much more ground, that's why she lost. I think she carried that much more ground because that was the move that needed to be made in order to have a chance to win the race. And you can look at it, and I kind of use the two motion horses as sort of the yin and the yang. You had that from Secret Message, but then on the flip side, you had Colonia, who saved all the ground, but the pace was so slow, and finally when she was extricated, she came with a giant late finish. I mean, she came home in 12:14 in the final eighth of a mile over yielding turf, but she just had too much to do, and there was no pace signed on in front of her, which is why I said it for this race. I picked Colonia in this race. I thought she ran just fine. I put her right back in my DRF horse watch. I would suggest you do the same. There's going to be a spot for her, whether she can clearly run on yielding, on firm, on whatever it may be. There's going to be an instance where she gets more pace to run at and things just happen to work out for her. She's going to be running on again at the end of one of these races. Now, whether it is a race like the QE2 down at Keeneland or they choose to go elsewhere, that remains to be seen. I think there is still a race for Colonia somewhere around here. Speaking of the QE2 down at Keeneland, John O'Donohue, who is the assistant to Neil Drysdale, the trainer of California Gold Rush, alluded to the fact that she could go from New York to Kentucky for the Grade 1 QE2 Cup down at Keeneland on October the 13th. As far as the rest of the field is concerned, you had a couple horses coming in here for the first time for Chad Brown. How often? Can you remember the last time you saw a graded stakes race on turf that Chad had 3 and not one of them hit the board? I can't remember the last time that happened. I don't know if it's ever happened, to be honest, to be frank. And I mean, even with like Breeders' Cup events, when Chad has 3 and none of them hit the board, it's like a comet. That doesn't happen. Victorine, she came over here. I thought she ran okay. She had a little bit of, maybe she didn't handle the turf really as well as they would have hoped. Capla Temptress, thought she was a little bit disappointing in the grand scheme of things, but she is that kind of horse that I think was a little bit taken out of her element, being as close to the pace as she was. There was no pace signed on, and she is the kind of horse that likes to be taken back, make one run, and try to go and get them down at the wire. At the end of the day, to me, this was an instance where you got a heads-up ride from Flavien Prat. You've got a very nice horse in California Gold Rush. She really hasn't done anything wrong in 4 lifetime starts, 3 of them victories. And she just, the perfect sort of storm. Everything worked out for her well here. We'll find out now if she can go on and replicate that and get a Grade 1 victory. I thought Secret Message ran well, but Colonia is the one, again, that I'm most interested in coming out of this race because, again, compromised by the pace situation. You could make the same argument for a horse like Reverse the Decision, the other Chad in this spot, or one of the 3 Chads in this spot. But the combination of a heads-up ride with a good, talented horse and a good training job, that winds up with California Gold Rush getting the job done in this year's Sands Point at Belmont Park with a 91 buyer, and it sounds like it's on to the Queen Elizabeth II Cup down at Keeneland. With all due respect to the horses we have discussed in the recaps and the other horses we will discuss in the upcoming recaps, the most exciting winner of the weekend, of a stakes race anyway, happened at Churchill Downs on Saturday afternoon. This was the field of 11 two-year-old fillies that went in the Pocahontas, and the favorite on the morning line and the favorite at post time was Serengeti Empress, breaking from the inside on the heels of an impressive victory, blowout victory, in the Ellis Park Debutante. She went out and won by more than 13 lengths. She came in here, stretching out to 2 turns for the first time, bet down to odds of 4 to 5. Again, you never know until they do it, but the pedigree at face value would suggest 2 turns wasn't going to be an issue, and she has legitimate early speed. What does that ultimately equal? A win by nearly 20 lengths. She gets the job done at odds of 4 to 5, pays $3.80, does Serengeti Empress. She defeats Splashy Kisses, who runs second, beaten 19.5 lengths. And the third place finisher, Lights Camera Action, rounds out the trifecta at odds of 19 to 1. This was an emphatic and very, very impressive victory from Serengeti Empress. Let's take a look at her horse card. She's 3 of 4 lifetime, just under $188,000 in career earnings. Owned by Joel Politi, trained by Tom Amos, bred by Tri-Equus Bloodstock LLC in Kentucky. Ridden to victory by Corey Lannery, and you can take a look at the pedigree. At the bottom of the horse card, she is by alternation out of a Bernardini mare named Havisham. Now, I'm sure this number is going to be a little bit sort of, I don't want to say lackluster or disappointing, but a 78 buyer speed figure for Serengeti Empress, and I'm sure some people will look at it and say, oh, that, it's way too low, it's way too low. I don't think you can make that argument because this number seems pretty cut and dry, pretty crystal clear when you had 2 mile and 16th races run back-to-back. You had this Pocahontas. This just followed the race prior, the Iroquois for the 2-year-old boys. And timing-wise, the boys did run faster than the girls did. But it's more the way that this race ended up for a horse like Serengeti Empress. She wasn't asked to run for the final better part of an eighth of a mile. Corey Lannery shook the reins at her at the top of the lane. She immediately responded, opened up even more, and then he realized, I don't have to ask her for anything. We know what we've got here. She wins by almost 20 lengths. She finishes in 33-27. Visually, this was awesome. Now, usually you get a little bit of, I want to say a tale of 2 stories instead of a tale of 2 cities, get it? As impressive as she was, she clearly beat a bad field. When the runner-up in a graded stakes race is earning a buyer speed figure of 48, clearly we're not dealing with a bunch of great horses. I think you're dealing with a very exciting horse, the winner. And now the question is, okay, we know she can just destroy a really, really inferior group. Can she do this against better horses? Now, the only time she's truly faced legitimate, what I think many people would consider graded stakes caliber 2-year-old fillies and potentially fillies that you'll be looking at come Breeders' Cup Friday for the Breeders' Cup juvenile fillies this year, was up at Saratoga in the Schuylerville. And to be fair, I don't think she ran poorly. I think that was an instance where it was her first time shipping, first time facing winners. She was up close to a pretty hot pace. And you know what? She got a little bit tired, but I believe she finished 4th that day. She wasn't embarrassed. Now you combine that was a little bit of a seasoning. That was experience. That was learning. Okay, you're not going to win them all. Very, very rarely do you get horses that just go out there and win, no matter what. I think she learned a lot that day up at Saratoga. She comes back, she buries the field in the Ellis Park debutante. Comes back here, buries this field by even more. When you look at the fractions incrementally, you break it down in formulator. She went 23-17, 23-77, 25-26, and 33-27. I thought this was just a thoroughly impressive beatdown of a bad group. Can she do this against better horses? The thing that makes me think that there is even more ability here than necessarily what's at face value is in the career debut, she sat off of a horse very comfortably. I don't think she has to have the lead. Now, her best races have come outright on the lead, but I don't think she is dependent on getting out there. I think she's very, very exciting, and naturally, the connections are very excited too. This is a quote from Tom Amos afterward. I think I speak for Joel and myself when saying we're very excited. We know we have a very nice filly. We hope to keep her healthy all the way to November. It would be great to win the juvenile fillies right here in our own backyard. And I think, again, after a race like this, it's human nature to look at it and be thinking, holy smokes, we might have something here. You also look at it from a pace standpoint, the way that this race was run with a chart. The horses that were in 2nd and 3rd, closest attendance to her, they ended up finishing 5th and 8th up the track, nowhere. And the horse that was in 3rd, by the way, ended up being the slight 3rd choice in here at odds of 4 to 1. Got beat by a country mile. This is a very, very exciting horse. Corey Lannery, also understandably excited, quoted after the race, "This could be the horse to take me to the next level. I was just a passenger today. I really didn't ask her much at all down the lane, so I was pretty surprised to come back and see the fractions we'd set, which I just alluded to." This is a very exciting filly. She has shown that now, okay, we know 2 turns not an issue. We know Churchill Downs isn't an issue. She has sat off of a target in the career debut. The pedigree would suggest even more distance isn't going to be a problem. She's in great hands, great connections. Lannery riding, Tom Amos trained. There's a lot to like about Serengeti Empress. Now, we'll find out what the other girls do in the weeks to come leading into the Breeders' Cup. But if you're looking for a horse that has checked plenty of boxes heading into arguably the biggest weekend of her career, you don't have to look much further than Serengeti Empress to look and say this is a horse that has a lot of things going for her headed into the Breeders' Cup. Fingers crossed she stays healthy and we get the best version of her on Breeders' Cup Friday, because Serengeti Empress could be an exciting one. And if you get through the short-term goal, which is the Breeders' Cup, you better believe that people are going to be having an eye on the first Friday in May here, coming up in about 7 months' time in the Kentucky Oaks. First things first, though. We have a graded stakes victor here. She gets the job done in the Grade 2 Pocahontas with a 78 buyer, but it looks like it's on to bigger and better things for Serengeti Empress and company. She's looking like a very interesting one for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. And the 2-year-old boys at Churchill on Saturday afternoon for the Iroquois. Here's the field of 12 signed on. Ultimately, post-time favorite landed on Tight 10 for Steve Asmussen. This was a horse that came in. Pedigree would suggest that 2 turns isn't an issue from a speed figure standpoint. He was just substantially faster than everyone else in this field. The question always is, though, until they do go 2 turns, you never truly know if they're going to be able to do it or not. Certain things would suggest they should, but you never truly know. Ultimately, Tight 10 did successfully navigate the 2 turns, but one horse was better than him. That horse, Cairo Cat. He gets the job done at odds of 17-1 for Ken McPeek and Brian Hernandez Jr. over your even money favorite Tight 10, who runs second, and Pole Setter runs third for Florent Giroux and Brad Cox at odds of 7-1. Let's discuss Cairo Cat a little bit more. He is 2 of 3 lifetime, over $133,000 in career earnings, owned by Walking L Thoroughbreds LLC, trained by Kenny McPeek, bred by Clifton Farm LLC in Kentucky, ridden to victory by BJ Hernandez. And you see that pedigree at the bottom of the horse card. This is a son of Cairo Prince, out of a tail of the cat mare named La Belle Cat. 80 buyer speed figure for Cairo Prince. I thought this was a solid victory, an encouraging victory. I don't think it's one that you're running right now to say he's the favorite for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, even though it's nice to know that you have a victory at Churchill Downs where the Juvenile will be this year. But it's more a matter of, I thought this was an effort that you can build off of. And even if, let's just say that the Juvenile is not the day for him and he doesn't shine that day, at least to me, the way that he moved makes me think that there's some upside here. That this could be a nice little horse. He did have a very good trip down on the inside, saved the majority of the ground in here. But at the same time, he did make a nice mid-race move. He traveled very comfortably. He was very professional, which again, at this point in their careers, that's not a given that these horses are going to handle things very, very easily and very well. Brian Hernandez kept him down on the inside for the longest time, waited, and finally angled out into the clear, just over heels of Cairo Prince, over Tight 10, and he went on and got the job done professionally, galloped out very well. I thought this was an encouraging effort from Cairo Cat. When you take a look of the top 4 finishers with their come-home times, Cairo Cat comes home in 31:15, Tight 10 31:38, Pole Setter 31:81, and Tobacco Road 31:97. Again, very encouraging effort from Cairo Cat. Sounds like the next stop for him will be the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Tight 10 has some things to iron out. From a pace standpoint, this was a race where it doesn't look like it was a fast pace, but when you look and see where the other horses that were up there prompting it ended up finishing, maybe you want to give Tight 10 a few extra bonus points here. But the bigger thing for him that he needs to iron out, he earned a 79 buyer, by the way. He's just still very green. You saw him swap leads down the lane, and I don't think that's a matter of him getting tired. I think that was just a matter of him just kind of figuring things out and not really knowing what the heck's going on. I thought it was a good effort. Again, one that you can build on. I think the top 2 and even the top 3, we'll talk about Pole Setter in a moment. The top 3, it really feels like, I don't think right now you're dealing with finished products just yet. I think there is room for improvement, and guess what? There has to be room for improvement if you're thinking about a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Or, let's be honest, many of these folks, they're looking at it saying, my horse runs well at Churchill Downs. Yes, the Breeders' Cup is the immediate goal, but the real goal for any of these horses, for any of these connections, they've got their eye on a bigger prize. They want to have a good horse for the first Saturday in May in 2019, looking at the potential of a Kentucky Derby contender. I think the top 2 are very nice. I think the top 3 are quite nice. Pole Setter, in the grand scheme of things, he tired pretty badly down the lane, but you've got to give him some extra credit because he carried a ton of ground in this spot. He was basically 4 or 5 paths off the rail throughout, and rounding the far turn, he actually put in a little bit of a threatening bid. He rolled up. He was only about a half length off the pace there for a moment. I thought Florent Giroux rode him as well as he could have, considering that draw and the way that everything shook down. Make that move, and hopefully you can sustain it. Instead, that whether you want to say it was a little bit of the early move or it was a combination of that plus the ground loss, he flattened out a little bit, but it was an encouraging enough move over to the dirt surface for this horse, and he has good connections behind him. Pole Setter is an interesting one going forward as well. I think the top 3 are all quite good. The rest of the field, not really all that sold on. I suppose maybe you want to give a couple of them the benefit of the doubt, but to be honest, to me, this was a race of, let me look at the top 3. I guess if you want to throw Tobacco Road in there, but it really, to me anyway, felt like the top 3 were pretty clearly the 3 best horses in this race from the way that they ran anyway. Cairo Cat, very professional for a 2-year-old. That was very, very encouraging. The 80 Buyer, not bad. That works if you think you're going to get a 5 to 10 point improvement. Come Breeders' Cup time, that puts him right there as far as the juvenile is concerned. Tight 10, he needs to iron some things out professionally, but I think he has ability. I don't think there's really any denying that. And then Pole Setter, considering how wide he was and that little bit of an early move rounding the far turn, thought this was a good effort as well. It's something that can certainly be built upon. You would have to think that the top connections in here, the top 3 finishers, they've got to be having their eye on the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. It sounds like that's immediately where Cairo Cat goes. But you also have to think in the back of their mind, they're hopeful, fingers crossed. You could be looking at contenders the first Saturday in May in 2019. First things first, though. It sounds like they're all going to try to get to a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Cairo Cat gets the job done in this year's Iroquois down at Churchill Downs, the 10th race on Saturday with an 80 Beyer speed figure. Winning you're in action Sunday at Woodbine for the boys and the girls. Let's start off with the girls on the turf. This was the field for the Grade 1 Natalma. Field of 13 signed on. This is a win and you're in for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf. You had My Gal Betty, who has done nothing wrong in her career to date. She was a perfect 3 for 3. She was bet down to odds of 5 to 2. But you had some interesting alternatives in this spot. Most notably, La Pelosa coming in from Europe for Charlie Appleby and Godolphin. She'd done some good things over there, kept good company. The question now was, how would she handle the shipping? And would this sort of 1 mile, 1 turn configuration be to her liking? Answer, indeed it was. Stretch run of this year's Natalma.
All names, and La Pelosa now showing interest in the center. Out in front, Eye in the Sky. Stillwater Cove running about 2 behind, but is coming. And Stillwater Cove getting to Eye in the Sky. La Pelosa coming after them very strongly now. And La Pelosa emerging in the center. La Pelosa goes up. My Gal Betty down the outside. They race to Stillwater Cove. And My Gal Betty after La Pelosa. Then Bold Script. It's La Pelosa and My Gal Betty. La Pelosa in front. And the Natalma to La Pelosa by a length 2 in second. My Gal Betty. Bold Script third. Then Pivotina, who ran on with still.
La Pelosa gets the job done as the second choice at odds of 3 to 1 over the post-time favorite, My Gal Betty, at odds of 5 to 2. And then to round out your trifecta, Bold Script gets the job done at 33 to 1. Should you have played the trifecta for $2, comes back $6.76 and some change. Let's talk about La Pelosa. She has 2 of 6 of lifetime, 5 times in the money, just under $170,000 in career earnings, owned by Godolphin, trained by Charlie Appleby, bred by Elton Lodge Stud in Ireland. You can see Jamie Spencer was aboard for the ride. And the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card, she is by Dandy Man out of a Bush Ranger mare named Lauren's Girl. 79 Beyer speed figure for La Pelosa winning. You have My Gal Betty with a 77, Bold Script with a 74, Pivotina with a 73, and Stillwater Cove with a 72. The pace was a major factor of this race. Take a look at those fractions at face value. 22 and 4, 45 and 1, 9 flat for 3/4. Helped those horses coming from off the pace. That includes La Pelosa. That includes a horse like Bold Script and Pivotina. My Gal Betty was a little bit closer, but she still took advantage of what that swift pace was. When you look at their final quarter miles, I think that's a big sort of piece that tells the story of this entire race. With as fast as they went early, the horses that were able to come from the back of the pack and make that big one run, they were the ones that took advantage. La Pelosa comes home in 23.69, My Gal Betty in 23.94, Bold Script in 24.02, and Pivotina 23.63. Perhaps you want to upgrade a horse like Stillwater Cove, who was relatively close to the pace. And okay, she got a little bit tired at the end, but again, considering those fractions, perhaps you want to give her the benefit of the doubt there. It sounds like La Pelosa is probably going to be going to the Breeders' Cup. This was a win and you're in for the Juvenile Fillies turf. And according to assistant trainer Alex Merriam, she's a lovely filly. She's turned a few heads this week. She's done everything right. We're really pleased with her. I think the Breeders' Cup has been in the back of Charlie's mind for a while. So we will find out. She is in. And should they choose to go there, I think you have to look at her as a legitimate threat. She was a little bit slow out of the gate, pop back to her left lead there at the wire. But considering this was her first start since earlier in August, first time coming over here, I think she is an interesting horse. My gal Betty, I think she was getting tired at the end of this race. She started drifting out in deep stretch. She was on her left lead as well. And again, many of these girls, and even the boys, when we talk about them in summer stakes, this is the first time they're doing something like this, going this sort of distance. And especially at Woodbine, that is such a demanding trip, that flat mile with that long, long stretch run, especially for babies. They're still figuring things out. I think many of these horses ran very, very well. Very disappointing effort from Artelina. You can only hope that everything is okay. But as far as the rest of the field is concerned, Eye in the Sky probably went too fast, and maybe a slight turn back in distance will be to this one's benefit. But La Pelosa, her stateside debut, passes with flying colors. She gets the job done in the Grade 1 Natalma with a 79 Beyer speed figure, and it sounds like this Godolphin-owned filly is going on to the Breeders' Cup. And the last recap on this week's recap edition is another Grade 1 from Woodbine on Sunday. This one was a win and you're in for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. The Grade 1 Summer Stakes. Chad Brown was sending a horse north called Fog of War. Fog of War won his debut at Saratoga, going 5.5 furlongs, but he's a little bit green in the process, and we talked about it when I spoke with Dawn Lupel going over the Sunday Woodbine play of the day, which happened to be the DRF race of the day. I said, you know, Chad's horses are usually very professional, but occasional instances, there are still very talented horses that are a little bit on the green side. Fog of War is still on the green side, but boy, do I think he's got a ton of ability. Here's the stretch run of this year's Summer Stakes.
By War of Will, Tricky Magician is there, Nash Trick and Sky Chief down the outside. Fog of War looking for room near the rail. Avies Flatter down the outside. Nash Trick trying to get by War of Will. War of Will in front, Avies Flatter out wide. Now Fog of War sees daylight and has started to come through very, very strongly in the center. Is running greenly. It's War of Will joined by Fog of War. Fog of War, the battle is on, and it's Fog of War coming out to score. Fog of War in the Summer Stakes, 3 parts of a length to War of Will. Nash Trick third, then Avies Flatter and Jungle Warrior.
Fog of War gets the job done in a 12-horse field at odds of even money. He defeats War of Will, who finishes second and is 2 lengths clear of the third-place finisher Nash Trick, going out for Luis Contreras. Let's take a look at Fog of War some more. He's a perfect 2 for 2, over $161,000 in career earnings, owned by Peter M. Brandt, trained by Chad Brown, bred by Orpendale, Chelston, and Wynat in Kentucky, ridden to victory by Javier Castellano. On the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card, he's by Warfront out of a Galileo mare named Say. 77 Beyer speed figure for Fog of War, winning this year's Summer Stakes. That pedigree that we just spoke of, it's giant on the dam side. You have risk averse. You know what the Warfronts are capable of. Chad Brown has this horse. So the thing that was most encouraging to me about this, when you watch and see, for the most part, he had a pretty perfect trip, let's be honest. But I love the way that he was willing to race kind of in tighter spots, also willing to split horses and go on with it. The left lead for basically the better part of the final eighth of a mile, I don't love it, but he's still a baby and he's still learning. And the reason that I'm going to be as kind to him for being a little bit on the green side, and I've said this in the past, when horses habitually do things goofy, usually I don't like that. There's really only one horse in recent memory that I can think of that was just not really the best as far as lead changes are concerned, but he just was that far superior to everyone else. It was Gunrunner. Usually you need them to be a little bit more on the professional side of doing things like that. But with babies, it sometimes takes them a little while to figure things out. And the other reason that you want to give him the benefit of the doubt is when you look and see his final quarter mile in this race as opposed to everyone else's. He came home in 23:63. When you take a look at the other horses that were closest to him, War of Will came home in 24:03, Nash Trick 24:20, Avies Flatter 24:16, and Jungle Warrior 23:98. Considerably faster than everyone else coming home. And the way that he galloped out like a monster. The thing that I think is most interesting and exciting about a horse like this, he's paired up Beyer speed figures of 77 in his first 2 starts. I think you're going to get a forward move in the next start, which presumably is going to be the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. I think he's going to want to run all day. And I understand the juvenile turf is only going to be at a mile and a 16th, so maybe that's not even going to be his best. I could very easily see this horse being a legitimate sort of Belmont Derby horse next year as a 3-year-old, races like the Secretariat, and then who knows? He's got to continue to improve. There's no question about it. But this looks like a very exciting prospect. When you hear the connections afterward talking about the horse, it gives you a little bit more context as well. Javier Castellano quoted saying, "I had a perfect trip. This is where it really starts to kind of stick out to me. This is such a special horse. He's got so much talent. I like the way he split horses at the quarter pole, and he finished really well. These are the kind of horses you want to ride with lots of potential." When Javier Castellano is saying that this is such a special horse and things of that nature, and he's at a point in his career where you don't have to just say things just to appease the connections and make them feel better. He's Javier. He can ride whatever he wants. If he's speaking this highly of this horse, and I think he's acknowledging also that there's a little bit of... He's still got some things to iron out. He's only going to get better once he does that. You hear Peter Brandt afterward. "Chad Brown and I looked at this horse, and we just liked the way we just liked the way he was made. He was a choice of ours, and he's really come through. He's a wonderful horse. Chad and his whole team have done a great job with this horse." This, to me, is going to be one of the short prices come Breeders' Cup time. Most of it will depend on what the Europeans decide to bring over, but Chad's record in the Breeders' Cup, especially with the juveniles, has been very, very strong. I think this is a very exciting prospect and additional ground. I'm telling you, I feel like a mile and a quarter is going to be his game. So I think he's going to be one of the major threats in a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. But going forward, way down the line, next year, give him some more improvement, X, Y, and Z, a little bit more professionalism. I think a race like the Belmont Derby, a Secretariat, all those types, those will be prime for him as a 3-year-old. Thought War of Will ran quite well. Got the first run on the pace situation. You take a look. There wasn't a ton of running going on from the back of the pack, but I think that was more a product of maybe those other horses coming from farther off of it or a little bit suspect as far as ability is concerned. The 2 horses that I liked also coming into this race that I thought ran fine, Nash Trick and Avi's Flatter. Now, the problem with each one of them, I thought they flattened out quite badly down the lane. Now, keep in mind, this was a stretch out in distance for a pretty significant one for Avi's Flatter. But Nash Trick had run at 7/8 of a mile, so I don't really want to use that as the excuse. And he loomed up and looked like he was ready for bear. He just kind of flattened out down the lane. So you don't want to be too harsh. Again, lightly raced, still ran just fine. This was not a bad effort by any stretch of the imagination. But you just do wonder a little bit. You're going to need to take a step forward here at some point. And now maybe is the distance a little bit too far for him. I think each one of those horses both have plenty of ability and plenty of potential going forward. I think War of Will certainly fits that bill as well, has plenty of potential, can certainly continue to improve and get better. To me, though, the one that is very clearly the most exciting prospect exiting a race like the summer is Fog of War. He wins this year's Summer Stakes with a 77 Beyer speed figure, and it looks like it is on to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. That is going to wrap up the recap portion of this show. We'll quickly throw it into a short stakes montage for this week, and then we'll get you ready with some best of as far as Beyer speed figures are concerned for this past weekend. Get you out of the door with a little bit of DRF TV schedule events still to come. So without further ado, here is this week's stakes montage.
Flexibility, Starship Jubilee and Halle Bell down the outside as they come down the stretch in the Canadian Stakes. Out in front, New Money, Honey and Flexibility. Starship Jubilee running a monster race on the outside, and Starship Jubilee has gone to the front with New Money, Honey on the inside battling on, and it's Starship Jubilee racing away. Luis Contreras and Starship Jubilee have torn on to win. A big winner of the Canadian Stakes. Starship Jubilee by 3.5. New Money, Honey and Flexibility and Bletchley. By a length to Boreal Spirit. Sweetgrass Creek coming on the inside. Sable Island, a big task for Pink Lloyd, is 5 behind, and Yorkton's run away. Yorkton well ahead, 4 in front of Boreal Spirit, Pink Lloyd, Sweet Little Man and Battle in Seattle, and it's Yorkton with a crushing win. Yorkton by about 5, close for second. On the outside, Sweet Little Man, back on the rail, Battle in Seattle.
Quarters 1:09.68. They're into the stretch, and Decorated Soldier has dead aim on the pacemaker. Don't be so salty. He's going a huge one. Decorated Soldier. Ghost Hunter is next. Matru is up on the far outside. Deep stretch. Decorated Soldier. A late closing Ghost Hunter. Don't Be So Salty, a huge third. 7, Mott True was fourth.
Awana also in with a shot there. All in it as they swing for home now. Deviser, Dabster, Colonist between those two. These three kick away from the others. Deviser outside, Dabster inside. Colonist has to pick it up. He's now 2 lengths away, and Dabster keeps going. Dabster with Deviser. Colonist diving down to the inside, but it's Dabster. Dabster and Joe Talamo clear in the Los Alamitos Special, and they'll win it by 2. Deviser second best. Colonist was third, and you got Awana.
There you have this week's brief stakes montage on the recap edition, and we'll quickly throw it into the weekend's best as far as Beyer speed figures are concerned. Now, again, when this list was put out initially, the figs for the Sunday 2-year-old races up at Woodbine had not come in yet, so this might be slightly off, but nonetheless, we'll go on with it. Here we go. 2-year-old males on dirt. Cairo Cat, you saw him, or we discussed him anyway, winning the Iroquois with an 80 Beyer speed figure. 2-year-old filly on dirt. I'm going to butcher the name, but you know what the sort of backstory is for Kofefe. She earned an 86. She looked great out there at Churchill Downs winning a maiden special weight race over the weekend. We'll find out where she shows up next. I wouldn't be surprised if it is a race like the Breeders' Cup. 2-year-old male on turf. Shazier, 62 in a maiden special weight at Gulfstream. Obviously, that honor likely now goes to Fog of War, exiting that Grade 1 Summer Stakes victory. 2-year-old fillies on turf. Fierce Scarlet, 79 in a maiden special weight at Belmont. She would share that honor with La Pelosa, the winner of the Natalma from Woodbine. 3-year-old male on dirt. Super Sol, a 90 and an optional claimer at Los Alamitos. 3-year-old filly on dirt. Aerosol, 85 and a non-winners of one other than at Gulfstream. 3-year-old male on turf. Morrison, an 85 and a non-winners of one other than at Belmont. 3-year-old filly on turf. We discussed California Gold Rush winning this year's Sands Point at Belmont with a 91 Beyer. Older male on turf, or on dirt, I should say. And really, again, this is in the internal system in daily racing form. The dirt and synthetic races are one and the same. So Yorkton winning the Bold Venture, that is considered a dirt race, and I'm going to roll with that. It was a 103 Beyer speed figure there. The older females on dirt, you had Blue Prize and Champagne Problems. They both earned 96 Beyers in the Locust Grove at Churchill Downs. Older males on turf, Oscar Performance with a 104 winning the Woodbine Mile. You saw that at the top of the show. And the older female on turf, Starship Jubilee, a 104 Beyer, winning the Canadian at Woodbine. There you have it. The weekend's best as far as Beyer speed figure performances are concerned on the Matt Bernier Show. DRF TV, what is to come this week? Big weekend of racing at parks. Most notably, you're going to have the Pennsylvania Derby, the Cotillion. This is going to be the last opportunity for these horses. Restricted 3-year-old opportunity for a Grade 1. After this, you have to go into the deep end and take on your elders. And it sounds like the Pennsylvania Derby is going to be a bang-up race as well as the Cotillion. The Cotillion, I think you're going to have all the big girls. So this should be a really, really fun weekend of racing. You're going to have the Weekend Warrior. You're going to have the latest edition of Out of the Gate. You'll have the preview edition of the Matt Bernier Show, the DRF Players Podcast. You name it. All sorts of stuff out there for you to find. Formulator angles, you got it. Over on video.drf.com or the Daily Racing Forms YouTube channel. Speaking of those, if you've been listening to this podcast live.drf.com, livestream.com, the Daily Racing Forms Twitter handle, at DRF Inside Post, or the Daily Racing Forms Facebook page. Thank you for doing so. If you listen to this podcast like most of you do, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, video.drf.com, or Spotify over on YouTube, click that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. Over on iTunes, write us a review, give us a positive rating. Questions, comments, concerns below the video player, or at me on Twitter, at Bernier_Matt. And there was an individual, I brought it up last week in the preview edition. If there was anybody that had a question about a horse, whatever it may be, fire away and I'll talk about them. In the preview edition, I'll do that. Someone was asking about a turf horse, and I will go over that in the preview edition, along with the NFL Week 3 trifecta. We're off to a very, very nice start, 5-1 through the first 2 weeks. And then we'll also talk about a couple of the big races coming up, whether it is the Pennsylvania Derby or the Cotillion or anything in between now and then. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you do so, take it in with the visuals as well. Until I come back with the preview edition at the end of the week. Best of luck however you play, whatever you play, wherever you play. Giant Pick 6 carryover coming up on Wednesday at Belmont Park. Probably going to want to take a look at that. Talk again soon. The Matt Bernier Show.